Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. The election of Donald Trump has brought many dramatic changes in society south of the border, with anti-immigrant policies leading to ICE raids and deportations, his so-called anti-woke policies against DEI, with many major corporations and educational institutions in the United States rolling back their DEI policies and programs for fear of retribution from the Trump administration. Some of that has already seeped over the border into Canada, with top sponsors of the nonprofit Pride Toronto, well-known brands such as Google, Home Depot, Nissan, and Clorox, pulling out of their sponsorships. We wondered if there were other impacts on Canada's nonprofit sector that we should be keeping an eye on. To help us unpack some of the latest developments, please welcome Naomi Racette, Executive Director of the Future Generations Foundation, or FG Foundation, where she developed extensive expertise in nonprofit governance, strategic development, grant-making, fundraising, business growth, all skills that support her transformative leadership in Indigenous philanthropy. A proud Cree Métis from Saskatchewan, Naomi has dedicated her career to strengthening First Nations communities and ensuring First Nations-led initiatives receive the funding and support needed for cultural revitalization, healing, and community development. She oversees large-scale program development, capital asset investment, financial management, and corporate partnerships focused on reconciliation. Under her leadership, FG Foundation has awarded $36.1 million to 8,440 First Nations and Métis individuals, fostering success through self-determined initiatives. She has also overseen the distribution of $59.7 million to First Nations organizations across Turtle Island, driving sustainable community-led change. Welcome to the podcast, Naomi.
Hi, Mary. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you. I'm so glad you could join us. Now, I understand that reconciliation in Canada is obviously not the same as DEI, but I am curious about how you would describe the current landscape for Indigenous-led work in the nonprofit sector in Canada.
Well, I guess I come from a real sort of hopeful position and positive position, and I see a lot of young, vibrant youth leaders taking on, coming from our grassroots organizations. I think we're seeing new organizations, First Nation and Indigenous organizations, lead in governance, leading in cultural and language programming. Of course, we always have strong advocacy because of our nature with our governments in Canada and how important it is for us as First Nations people to be constantly, pushing the envelope with our federal and provincial and municipal partners. We're seeing new leaders rise every day. There are new FGF, Future Generations Foundation, is creating new partnerships every day and finding new champions. So I guess I'm really hopeful about the nonprofit sector in Canada and, Indigenous and First Nations people really leading in that space. So, of course there's a few of us, not many of us, but I think the ones that are involved in it are strong and are really pushing the envelope. So I'm really hopeful.
And how are recent political decisions in Canada impacting the work of Indigenous-led organizations and their relationships with nonprofits?
Well, politics plays, that political decisions have always affected First Nations lives. Our lives have been governed by our treaties, by the colonial systems, the Indian Act. The Indian residential school has affected us, the murdered missing women. Like, we're really affected by the politics of the day. And I think it's no difference. When we look at the nonprofits and First Nations communities, there is a really unique system in the sort of nonprofit charitable space of First Nations. And that's this definition of a qualified donee and granting to qualified donees. But, in all honesty, we're now seeing with income tax law changes in Canada that there's some ability to start really working directly with First Nations communities that don't subscribe to the qualified donee regulation. We also have our own political systems. We have the Assembly of First Nations, where all our leaderships and chiefs, they work together. So when we see political decisions, particularly from our southern neighbors, um, it affects us, but I think it affects us differently in some ways. In Canada, we have a currently prime minister, that's really business orientated. Prime Minister Carney is really business orientated, and he's pushing for this new bill C3. I know today, oddly enough, leaders are meeting here in Canada. All First Nation chiefs and leadership are meeting here in Ottawa about that bill, and it's a for us, it's always often when government has policy, it affects our rights. It threatens our sovereignty, it threatens our inherent rights. So we spend so much time advocating against those things, going to court, that sometimes that takes us away from some of the really important charitable work that we need to do. The nonprofit space of cultural, language, education, family connection, are empowering our youth. I think it's unfortunate that politics affect us so directly, but there's always effects on us.
Well, I'm curious about that. In fact, that has Prime Minister Carney's public declarations that the intention is of this government to consult with um, Indigenous First Nations. Does that give you any comfort, or not? What are your primary concerns?
I don't know. I'm out of the space of economic development, to be honest. I work solely in the charity, but I do know I've read Bill C5, and I just feel again that it's just a rights threatening resource extraction bill. And we're going to have to advocate against it and make sure our voices are heard and make sure we're part of the dialogue. And we have a real obligation to be land stewards, and our relationship with land is really inherent to who we are as First Nations people. So I think over the years we've seen many political leaders come and go and say different things, but for us it really is about advocacy, inclusion, and allowing our voice to be heard at the right tables and to hear us. So I'm hoping today, here we are in Ottawa today with all our leaders coming in to Ottawa to discuss with Mark Carney's government around Bill C5, and to really make our voices be heard about the 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 resource extraction bill that we think this bill is put before us. So I don't know. I want to be positive and say yes, I want to believe him, but I'm not so sure.
Well, we often hear nonprofits speak about reconciliation, but there can be such a gap between words and actions. From your perspective, what does it really mean for an organization to be in right relations with Indigenous communities?
Right relations is one of those sort of words when you think about. I always go back to who I am as a First Nations person and Indigenous person in this country, and my relationships. So when we say right relations, I think of first I think of my family relations, the relationship of family that we have, that long-term connection, the respect for our elders and our ancestors, how we seek our family for the guidance of relations. And then sometimes there's relationships that, even in our family can be challenging and difficult, but you always sort of work them out. So when I look at that sort of small circle of relation, and then I also look at relationships of community, how in community we're all valued. We try to make everybody equal. We accept everybody's equal and has equal voice. We're working for the collective. There's a real reciprocity in, the community base. You give, you take, you share. Then we have our relationship with, of course, the land and the animals and the water. And it's not an extractive relationship, right? You're working towards that's the sort of sustainable practice piece, and I think, and then of course we have our sort of our leadership relationships, how we establish and we cultivate and we work We work in those relationships that are really rooted in trust, respect, mutual support for our communities and our people. So when I think about being in right relations, I think about those four relationships and how you harvest those types of relationships you have in your partners, right? And if that's and in your relation, if that's how you can build, I think that's how you can build a solid rights relationship with Indigenous communities and Indigenous partners. If that makes sense, that's sort of how I see. I always go back to the beginnings of relationships for me when I think about right relations.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me. It's a very holistic sort of view of it. It would seem. Um, do you believe the nonprofit sector is making meaningful progress when it comes to reconciliation, or are we still stuck in symbolic gestures? And what needs to change? I mean, we did talk about, you mentioned off the top, the whole changing of the tax act to make it easier to fund non-qualified donees, and in large part that was influenced by the desire to try and free up funding to organizations that were grassroots and in the community and knew what the communities needed, but for one reason or another, were not actual qualified donees, i.e., charities. And I'm curious, that was certainly a significant step to a significant achievement to actually change that law. And I'm curious whether you're seeing any significant change since then.
Oh, you started with reconciliation, and symbolic gestures and the changes. I don't think reconciliation is one sort of act. I guess from my perspective, I think there's three parts to reconciliation. And I think that's how maybe that's how I've broken it down for it to be very digestible for me to feel that we're making positive action. But it is going to take time. Remember, the colonial history of Canada is over 500 years long. So I think we have to give ourselves a little bit of time to get, you know, to address that long history. So when I think of reconciliation, I think there's the first part, which is like the learning, the truth telling, the remembering. And I think Canada finally knows about residential schools, and I think it's being written into our curriculum. I think we now have a national day of reconciliation, truth and reconciliation of September 30th, with Orange Shirt Day. I think we've launched a commission on the unmarked burials and missing children. I think we're really starting to. I think we really, as Canadians, if I step out of being a First Nations Canadian, I think we're really starting to know, remember, and accept the truth telling that's happened with the history of Indigenous Canadians. And then I think the next phase is understanding. Like, sure, you can hear it, but do you really understand what the systematic colonial systemic system that Canada has imposed on First Nations people and Indigenous people over these generations has caused? Do you have deep compassion for a system that was out to kill the Indian? As it was forced, we were forced through residential schools. We lost a whole generation of children through the 60 scoops. We went through Indian hospitals. We still have plights like murdered and missing women. So, and I think, are we really understanding that it's going to take us generations to move beyond that intergenerational trauma, and to revitalize some of our language and culture that were at one point criminalized. So I sort of believe that Canada is in that phase now, that understanding. I think more folks and more partners have more understanding than others, but I definitely think we're in a flux. And then I think the last phase is the sort of participation and action in reconciliation. And I think some partners are doing great things. I think some corporates are stepping in and really helping out. I also think there's a lot of people involved and taking action and are participating the best way they can in reconciliation. But I think that sort of action, reconciliation, as we call it, are you supporting First Nation folks in the long term health of their families, their communities across generations? Are we creating space for First Nations and Indigenous folks to participate in boards, in government, in action, in schools, in communities? So I sort of think we're in between 2 and 3, depending on where your corporate policy is, where you're at as a business, as a nonprofit, as an organization. But we still have a long way to go. But I'm very hopeful, and I think it'll just take us some time to get there.
And I'm curious whether you mentioned just in that answer, you're seeing the shifts in how corporate funders and philanthropic organizations are investing in Indigenous-led initiatives. And we did touch on this idea of the impact of the changes to the Tax Act as well to make it easier to give to non-qualified donees, i.e. the community-based, many of them Indigenous led organizations that weren't charities. And I'm wondering if all of that piece has actually changed for you. Have you seen significant changes, and if so, what they might be?
Well, as a fundraiser, Future Generations Foundation is fundraising. We're really starting to see some really strong partners come out of, the work. Our corporate partners are really starting to step up and support us in our philanthropic goals, because, we have a pretty a big footprint. We are a national organization that is really funding in community. We've funded I think, probably over 350 First Nations communities directly, and another 500 First Nations or Indigenous organizations. So I think those corporate side on the philanthropy is coming. But then when you look at the bigger sphere of what types of money is going to First Nations, all of it is actually coming. Most of it is coming from us to us, right? Coming from a First Nations organization to First Nations out of our settlement agreement. So I don't know. I am hopeful, and I think that corporates are starting to step in that space, because I think they do know they want to do more. They need to do more, and now they're trying to figure out how they can do more. But also on that same breath, FG Foundation is the biggest funder of First Nation initiatives in the country, right? So it's a bit of a crux.
Right. Well, you raise an interesting point. I wasn't quite aware of. It's really quite enlightening in and of itself, isn't it? We know that Indigenous organizations have historically received a fraction of philanthropic funding compared to non-Indigenous counterparts. I mean, it's supposed to be still under 1%. In your view, although according to data that I've seen, that increased around the time, of course, or shortly after the discovery of, graves on residential school sites, we saw a spike, but then the data I saw showed that it kind of stabilized. It then sort of went back to sort of a stabilized level. And I'm curious, whether that imbalance has been shifting at all, from, I guess, other donors that aren't necessarily Indigenous funders.
It's interesting when you said the 1%, that at one point only 1% of the philanthropic dollars. When you look deeper into that 1%, I think 85% of that is from us, right? Is from FG Foundation to First Nations. So it's a very odd statistic, that one. And you're right. I think the amount of funds going to Indigenous and First Nations is very small. I don't see a shift. I haven't seen much of a shift per se. But I will say, as I reach out more and more and more to new partners, there's definitely an appetite, I believe, to do more. I think our corporates, and the corporations and those that have wealth, I think they want to help. But I definitely think maybe they don't know how to help, or they don't know who to help. And because, the relationship, I think, between First Nations and settlers has been, there's been some ebbs and flows. There's been some tough times. We've gone through some difficult, colonial policy as First Nations people in Canada. So I think, there's that hesitancy to want to work with non-Indigenous partners, and to move. If philanthropy really wants to move into that space, I think they're really going to have to think about their relationship they want to have. I think they're going to have to turn the traditional grantee-grantor relationship on its head and move into a very different space if they want to have successful Indigenous partners. And I think there's lots of organizations that are really moving into that space. And I'm very fortunate that I'm starting to really develop some really great partners. But of course, there's always the ones that, they don't work out as well as you'd hoped, or you have to work a little bit harder to make sure everybody is on the same page. And I think, a way, if we were to try and make it a little bit more equitable, like that philanthropic space, I think we have to worry about, finding strengths in your First Nations partners, your organizations, and not think about the deficits, because, there are so many, we always work from a place of often resource limits. We're always limited in resources, but if we can work from a place of strength, I believe that maybe that might be a place where we can start, especially particularly with philanthropy. Indigenous people have been philanthropic for a long time, but just not the way that I think conventional philanthropy has been thought about. We have ceremonies, we call it the giveaway, and it really is about, take what you need, leave the rest, give away, no hoarding, and we still practice that. When we go, you can still quite easily be part of a giveaway ceremony. So I think traditionally we're quite philanthropic. I believe partners really want to move into that, but I don't know if we're quite there yet. And the political climate and the economy always plays a part into philanthropy. So lots of things in there, I think.
And what role can Indigenous-led nonprofit organizations play in shaping public policy and nonprofit practice? Are enough spaces being made for that kind of leadership within our own sector?
Well, First Nations are definitely not shy at always advocating at public policy. We've been under government jurisdiction, data collection, researching of us for years. The government's been doing that, and the control of data is a really big piece for us. There's been a lot of policy made about First Nations people on data that was collected not by us, had no Indigenous methodologies involved in it, and it often influences policy in a way that is quite harmful to us. So I think when we think about how we can get in those spaces, and particularly in the nonprofit sort of policy, I think they're starting to create space for us in at the leadership roles. Like I know, PFC, the Philanthropic Canadian Foundations, they're opening up their foundation and their membership to Indigenous members, which is really, it's new. It's allowing us an opportunity to be in that room. There was a special Senate committee on the charitable sector, and I know we had an opportunity to make comment and be influential in and have our voices heard. So I think there is opportunity, but then there's also the other coin of that is we are so limited as First Nations people as leaders. Our communities are so strapped for capacity of our own leaders to lead our own organizations, to then step in and be leaders of other non-Indigenous organizations. It's a different place for us, and it often means taking us away from the work we know that our communities really need. So it can be a bit of a double-edged sword for us. We want to be involved in bigger discussions, bigger places, but it often means that we have to take away from our own communities or our own organizations to be able to go into those spaces. And we're so under capacity in our own, it's hard, it's a balance. So it just goes to that, we have to build capacity, we have to educate, we have to empower, we have to strengthen, our youth, our leaders, our women, our young men to become part of the bigger community and get involved at all levels of, government, of the nonprofit, of charitable, of finance, to be able to do those things.
Are there emerging models or partnerships that you've seen that point to a more equitable future in how the sector works with Indigenous communities?
Well, you'll hear it more and more, the idea of, trust-based philanthropy, you know, and how, moving more to that strong, equitable relationship between grantees and grantors, and, being collaborative. So I think there's definitely new models in there. But I think, when working with Indigenous and First Nations folks, I think there's a few things that you're going to have to sort of think about more and be more readily to work with. I think you're going to have to move beyond just the check support. It's always nice. We really appreciate having funds to be able to allow the work that we want to do. But I also think offering, other supports, like maybe communication support. Maybe your corporation has a great communications department. Offering that support as well as a check. I think those are really important relationships to form when you're looking at sort of building a partnership. I think the transparency and responsive. I think just being open to have conversations and honestly to talk honestly, about the kind of partnership your organization or the First Nation organization needs or wants, and just be really frank and honest. I think that really helps in that sort of building models of partnership. And paperwork, we all have to do paperwork always, and that's part of transparency and accountability. And I really do think it's important. We implement it in our granting streams too, but I think we also have to be prepared to think of other ways and other models of taking in that reporting. We may have to invest more in administration to support people who can help those working in Indigenous communities. Those working in Indigenous communities are so overworked, and to fill out paperwork, it's hard. So I think as the corporate or the organization, you need to be willing to support. You have to also consider that maybe oral or other methods of taking in are part of that, finding a new model of partnership. And I think the key advice of when working with it is be patient and focus on the long term. Indigenous communities, things affect us differently. And, as a funder, I know sometimes you want things to happen within a 6-month grant cycle, but it can't happen like that sometimes in community, just because of, you're in the north and you have to hunt for food for 2 months of those 6 months. That's just the reality of where you live. So, be patient and focus on the long term. I think those are sort of the things you need to think about when you're sort of modeling out a partnership.
Now, we opened up with some, I guess, observations about, across North America, we're seeing a backlash against DEI work, especially in corporate and institutional spaces. Are you seeing this at all reflected in how Indigenous-led organizations are funded or supported in Canada?
From my perspective, because I'm a First Nations funder to First Nations, I'm feeling pretty insulated against that sort of DEI backlash, and particularly what's happening in the South. And I personally think in Canada, I think DEI is a little bit of a different sort of place. I think it's a lot about removing barriers, offering equal opportunity. I don't think it's necessary of what I've seen from some of my partners of quotas and numbers like it is in the South. I also think, the past 10 years of reconciliation talk won't leave Canadians so quickly. I think Canadians have really struggled with the relationship they've seen with our Indigenous relations over these years. We heard about, you mentioned it earlier, the missing and murdered children at residential school. I think that really shocked. I know it shocked all of us deeply, but I also think it really shocked Canadians. So I believe Canadians won't so quickly forget, and I think they know, I think they now know, from all the truth and reconciliation work and that first phase of reconciliation of learning and truth telling. I believe Canadians won't be so quick to move back away from supporting Indigenous folks. And then I also think about, values, the Canadian value, the values that Canada holds, and then the values we hold as, Indigenous people. And I think there's a lot of alignment in those cultural values, the respect for land, truth, community, honesty, wisdom, humility. I think those are all, they're all Indigenous values, but I also believe Canadians have those values too. So I honestly think that we're relatively currently as Indigenous folks now. I wouldn't talk. I can't speak at all to our our Black community brothers and sisters and how they're feeling. Um, but I definitely can speak from my side that I feel that we're a little bit more insulated from the backlash from it.
And with the kind of political polarization that's increasing, certainly south of the border, and some argued even with recent events where Canadians with the election seem to move and come together in the middle. Um, Still, in this environment that can be so challenging, how can Indigenous-led organizations and their allies stay rooted in justice-focused work without being sidelined by these current trends?
Oh, that one's a tough one because we're so First Nations and Indigenous folks are so politically are so affected by the politics of the day, right? We talked about earlier about how Bill C-5 and that the resource extraction bill is affecting us. I think if we want to stay, how we can stay sort of justice focused and stay away from, maybe the sway of the hot topic of the day. I think we have to stay grounded in First Nations community priorities. As funders and as people working in this space, listen to what community organizations and the First Nation people that you have in your organizations. Listen to what they're saying. Center the conversations on the values that your organizations share. Don't be afraid to work with First Nations on their capacity and understand that, even though we might, but the political topic of the day is going to be it's going to affect us all for a short time. It won't affect us, hopefully, for the long time, for the long term. And, I wish I could say how we cannot be sidelined, but because we're so dependent on always for Indigenous people, we're always fighting the governments. It will affect us, but it shouldn't affect our core work, right? Our core work is strengthening our families, building on education, culture, and language. I think those are some key priorities for First Nations people at the moment. And I think if we have our nonprofit partners and our corporate partners and our philanthropic partners stay rooted in those, I think we'll stay rooted in the sort of justice focused work for the long term that we need to, and to turn out all the political noise.
Thank you so much for your keen insights and advice for nonprofit leaders who may be struggling themselves to navigate these challenging times while trying to continue to promote DEI and embrace reconciliation within their own organization. Thank you very much for joining Charity Village Connects.
No worries. Thanks, Mary. Have a great day.